The wind that morning was sharp enough to cut skin, and it carried with it the bitter memory of war. I thought I had left all that behind, thought I had buried the battles, the smoke, and the screams in the mud of distant fields. My horse's hooves crunched over the frost-bitten trail as the outline of the cabin came into view. It was supposed to be a new beginning. My Uncle Jeremiah's land, handed down to me as a chance to live different. No more commands shouted over cannon fire, no more blood-soaked soil. Just wood, grass, and the silence of the hills. But nothing in this life comes without a fight. The first thing I saw wasn't the warmth of home or the promise of peace. It was 5 bodies swaying from ropes, hanging like broken lanterns before the gate. Their dresses torn, their skin pale in the morning light, their bare feet brushing against the wind as though the earth itself refused to claim them. Signs hung from their necks, scorched with words that burned deeper than any flame. What belongs to Morrison will always belong to Morrison. I felt my throat close, my chest tighten. I had thought I'd seen enough of death to last a lifetime, but this was no battlefield. This was cruelty staged for me alone, a warning hammered into flesh and rope. My horse reared, nostrils flaring, and I had half a mind to turn back. But then I saw it, the faintest stir of a chest, the smallest flicker of breath against the cold. They weren't gone. Not yet. In that moment, I knew peace was nothing more than a lie I'd been telling myself. By cutting those ropes, I wasn't just saving lives. I was stepping into a storm that would tear every last thread of my past open again. And my friend, if you've ever thought a man could outrun his own war, let me tell you right now, you can't. You only carry it to new soil, and sometimes that soil soaks up more blood than the last. I dismounted with hands that shook, though not from the cold. War had taught me how to handle the dead, but it had never taught me how to handle the dying. Their necks bore raw, red marks where the ropes had bitten deep, their bodies battered with bruises and lashes that told of deliberate torment. Whoever had done this hadn't simply wanted them gone. They wanted them to suffer, and worse, they wanted their agony to speak for them. One by one, I cut the ropes, lowering their weight into my arms. I could feel the faint life trembling inside each frame, like a candle flickering in a draught. 5 of them, 5 women chosen not by chance but by design, their broken bodies left like bloody signatures at the threshold of my inheritance. I dragged them beneath the awning of the cabin, laid them out across the cold wooden floor, and worked with clumsy, desperate hands to free their wrists and ankles from the bindings. Inside the cabin, the darkness pressed heavy, dust thick as old cloth. I lit a fire with what little dry wood remained, the flame catching and throwing their faces into view one by one. Each face told a different story. A scarred fighter's defiance. A red-haired fury that hadn't dimmed even in near death. A gentle beauty marred by grief. A quiet shadow whose eyes still calculated even in weakness. And the steady, older one, who radiated the strength of a mother refusing to let despair take root. I hadn't asked for this. All I had wanted was silence, a place where ghosts couldn't find me. But the cabin Jeremiah left me was no refuge. It was a battlefield, and the first shots had already been fired. The fire's glow spread across the cabin walls, and for the first time since stepping off that trail, I saw what I had inherited. Not land, not timber, not a roof to shield me from rain. I had inherited a war already raging long before I arrived. The signs hung on their chests had said enough. Morrison, a name I had heard in whispers even before I rode into this valley. A man cloaked in the guise of a judge, a man who bent law into shackles and called it justice. Out here, he was more than a tyrant. He was a disease that seeped into every acre of soil, every town hall, every frightened pair of eyes. As I watched the women stir faintly against the flicker of the fire, I realized this was no warning left at random. They had been strung up at my gate for a reason. This land wasn't meant to be mine in Morrison's eyes, because in his world, nothing truly belonged to the living unless he allowed it. Uncle Jeremiah had fought to hold it, and now that fight had fallen to me. The cabin creaked in the wind, but beneath the crackle of flames I could almost hear Jeremiah's voice, the same words he once repeated like scripture. Land is not held by paper, boy. It's held with blood. Back then I had thought him a hard man, maybe even cruel. Now I knew he had only been telling me the truth. I sat with my rifle laid across my knees, staring into the fire. 5 broken bodies breathed unevenly behind me, yet I felt the weight of an army pressing down. This wasn't inheritance. This was a test, and the choice was already clawing at my chest. Either cut ties and leave, or plant my boots in the dirt and make this land my stand. By the time the fire had burned steady, their breathing grew stronger, though their faces still bore the story of rope and lash. I tended them as best I could, pouring water into cracked lips, sharing scraps of bread I had carried in my saddlebag. Their eyes opened one after another, hazy with pain but burning with something deeper than fear. I saw it clearly now. These were not victims chosen by chance. They were symbols, meant to frighten, meant to warn, and above all meant to remind me that this valley belonged to Morrison. I told myself I could still walk away. My horse was saddled, the trail back open. Yet every time I looked at them, trembling but alive, I knew that leaving would strip me of whatever manhood the war hadn't already stolen. I had cut the ropes, and by doing so, I had bound myself tighter than any noose ever could. The night stretched long, shadows crawling across the cabin walls while the wind screamed outside. My rifle rested across my lap, each bullet already weighed in my mind as if fate itself might demand every one of them before sunrise. Jeremiah's words haunted me. Blood for land. I had never wanted it to be true, yet the evidence lay before me in the bruises of 5 women who had refused to bow. When sleep finally came, it was restless and sharp, filled with echoes of drums and gunfire from wars I thought I had buried. I woke to the sound of hoofbeats rolling through the valley, steady and deliberate. Not the scattered sound of wanderers, but the rhythm of men who rode with purpose. I stepped to the porch with the Winchester in hand, and through the lifting fog I saw them. Black horses, broad shoulders, and the unmistakable posture of men who believed the world belonged to them. They sat their horses on the ridge like wolves testing the edge of firelight. At first there were only 3, their coats long, rifles resting easy in their hands as if death was no more trouble to them than lighting a cigarette. But soon more joined, dark shapes slipping out of the trees until a dozen riders circled in the mist, their torches glowing like the eyes of predators. At their center rode a man I had no need of introduction to. Morrison. Even at a distance, his presence pressed down heavy, the way a storm presses against the ribs before it breaks. He didn't shout, didn't raise his weapon. He simply looked, his hand resting on the butt of a silver revolver, calm as stone. That silence told me more than 1,000 threats. Behind me, inside the cabin, the women stirred. I could hear the rasp of their breath, the shifting of weak limbs against the wooden floor. They had survived the noose only to be delivered again to the hands of the man who had ordered it. My chest tightened at the thought of them dragged back into the night, their defiance crushed under the heel of his law. No. If Morrison wanted them, he would have to come through me, and through the very walls of Jeremiah's cabin. I knew what that meant. A siege. A storm of lead and fire that would tear this quiet valley into a graveyard before the sun had time to set again. Yet, standing on that porch with my Winchester warm in my grip, I felt something I hadn't in years. Clarity. The war I had run from was here, but this time it wasn't about generals or flags. It was about land, about survival, and about justice carved out of the dark by men and women who refused to bow. Night fell faster than I expected, as though the valley itself wished to cloak what was about to unfold. The riders spread wide, their torches painting the fog in shades of fire and shadow. The cabin, once Jeremiah's quiet retreat, now stood as the lone obstacle between Morrison and his claim. Inside, the air thickened with smoke from the hearth. The women pressed against the walls, their eyes wide but burning. I handed out what weapons I had, not enough for a war but enough to buy us time. A Colt that had seen better days. A sawed-off shotgun I had carried since the war. A musket, old but steady. And knives, dulled by use yet sharp enough to spill blood when pressed into desperate hands. I remember their faces as clearly as I remember the bite of gunpowder in the air. Rope marks still carved into their necks, bruises fresh, but beneath it all a fire that no rope had managed to strangle. Each of them knew what was coming. Each of them had already been marked for death. Now they had nothing left to lose but the chance to strike back. Outside, Morrison's men jeered, their laughter riding the wind, filling the valley with the kind of cruelty only men certain of victory can summon. They thought they were hunting prey. They thought we would break the moment bullets tore through these wooden walls. But I had stood in worse places, against worse odds, and I had walked away. The war had taught me how to turn fear into steel, and I knew that by dawn, either this cabin would stand as a beacon or it would be nothing but ash buried under bodies. The first bullet shattered the silence like glass. It struck the gatepost in a spray of splinters, and before the echo had faded another volley followed. Windows burst, wood cracked, and the night filled with the thunder of rifles. The cabin shook beneath the rain of lead, but I kept my back against the wall, Winchester steady, breathing slow. The war had taught me one lesson above all: panic kills faster than bullets. I moved with purpose, lever snapping, each shot finding the outline of a rider in the firelit haze. One fell from his horse with a scream, another toppled into the mud, clutching his chest. The women fought beside me, their pain transformed into fury. The red-haired one fired the Colt with a rage that echoed louder than the gun's bark. The blonde gripped the shotgun so tightly her knuckles blanched, yet when she pulled the trigger the blast tore two men from the porch in a spray of blood and smoke. The older one lit a jar of kerosene and hurled it through the window. Flames roared into the night, halting the charge of Morrison's riders, their horses rearing against the wall of fire. Smoke filled the cabin, acrid and choking, but it masked us as much as it threatened to suffocate. Shadows moved through the broken windows, raiders slipping inside with knives and pistols. That's when the quiet one struck, swift, precise, a blade in the dark that silenced a man before he could scream. Blood pooled on the wooden floor, mixing with ash and splinters, but we held. Outside, Morrison barked orders, his voice cold and commanding, steady even as his men dropped one by one. The storm of bullets grew heavier, every wall chewed through by lead. Still we fought, still we endured, because surrender meant rope, fire, and silence forever. Through the smoke and fire I saw him at last, Morrison stepping forward like a man carved from the very stone of the valley. His black coat billowed behind him, torchlight glinting against the polished steel of the revolver in his hand. He walked slow, deliberate, every step measured, as though bullets and screams were nothing more than a backdrop to his own authority. Men like him thrive on fear. They build kingdoms from the silence of those too broken to resist. But that night, for the first time, I saw hesitation flicker across his face when he looked at the cabin and realized we had not broken. He called out into the firelit chaos, his voice steady as a church bell. He told me this land was his, that Jeremiah had only borrowed it, that blood and rope were the only signatures that mattered here. Each word struck harder than the bullets, not because of their truth, but because of how deeply he believed them. Out here, law was not ink on paper. It was the will of the man most feared. I rose from my cover, the Winchester heavy but steady in my grip, and for the first time that night I stepped out onto the porch into the rain of lead. Smoke swirled around me, fire painted the horizon, and Morrison stood a mere 30 yards away, revolver raised, eyes cold as iron. Behind me, the women gathered their last strength, battered yet unbroken, their presence at my back like a wall of defiance no bullet could pierce. The valley seemed to still in that moment. Gunfire faded to a distant echo, horses snorted nervously, and the night air burned with tension. This was no longer a siege, no longer a hunt. This was the crossing of two storms, and the ground between us was about to be claimed in blood. The world narrowed to the cabin, the ridge above, and the space between Morrison and me. His men had fallen, scattered in blood and smoke, yet he remained, walking forward like a shadow born of steel. Each step was a challenge, each movement a statement. This land is mine. All who stand against me will die. But standing there on the porch, rifle in hand, I felt the calm clarity I hadn't known in years. War had shaped me into something Morrison had never accounted for. A man who had seen death, carried it, and yet refused to surrender to it. The women moved with me as one body, instinct and desperation intertwining. The red-haired one fired at shadows darting in the mist. The blonde's shotgun barked through the night, stopping a man who tried to flank us. The older woman's musket sang death from the far window. The quiet one darted in the smoke, blade flashing, and the black-haired woman kept watch from the porch with a Colt, green eyes blazing like fire. They were no longer victims. They were a force, and together we formed a line Morrison could not break without spilling his own blood. I raised the Winchester, sighting the distance, and saw him hesitate. Not fear. He had no fear, but the first sign that his perfect control was fraying. Out here, the law he had twisted into chains had no power against a man who had already inherited survival, a man who had taken responsibility for those who could not defend themselves. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and sweat, flames flickering on the walls, casting every scar, every rope mark, every bruise into sharp relief. Morrison's shadow grew larger, but so did our resolve. Every second that ticked between us was a choice, to back down or to stand. And that night we had no choice left but to stand, because the valley demanded it, the cabin demanded it, and I had sworn it with the weight of every life that had been handed to me. The firelight flickered across the cabin as Morrison closed the distance, revolver raised, his eyes sharp as steel. The valley seemed to hold its breath, the night deafened by anticipation. I stepped onto the porch, feet planted in frozen earth, rifle in hand, feeling every heartbeat hammer like a drum in my chest. Behind me, the women had taken their positions, each weapon ready, each gaze unwavering. We were no longer 5 broken women and a lone man. We were a wall of defiance against a tyrant who had believed fear would bend us. Morrison's voice cut through the night, low and venomous, declaring ownership of the land, of life, of every ounce of power he had stolen. Yet the words rang hollow in the face of truth. I had the proof he could not undo. Papers, forged contracts, testimonies of every crime, every life he had twisted into chains. The black-haired woman held out the evidence, and I watched the color drain from his face, replaced by raw fury. He lunged for his revolver, and instinct took over. 2 shots from my Winchester rang like thunder. The first drove him off balance. The second shattered his shoulder, sending the gun clattering across the frozen ground. The women surged forward, precision and fire blending into a deadly rhythm. Ruby's blue eyes flared as she ended his reach, while the others disabled the remaining men with cold efficiency. The night air filled with the echoes of their screams, fading under the roar of gunfire and the crackle of the fire we had built. Morrison fell to his knees, the weight of truth pressing heavier than any bullet. His reign ended not in whispers, but in the undeniable strength of those he had underestimated. At last, the valley exhaled, the smoke curling into the stars, and for the first time, the cabin felt like home, not a battlefield. The night faded slowly, the valley thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder. Morrison was bound, his face pale and twisted in a mix of rage and disbelief, while his surviving men lowered their heads, unable to meet the eyes of those they had once terrorized. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls, painting every scar, every rope mark, every bruise into sharp relief. Yet the women stood tall, their breathing heavy but steady, eyes no longer filled with fear, but the fire of survival. I looked around at them. Each had survived a nightmare. Each had faced a tyranny and refused to bend. We began cleaning the cabin, dragging the bodies outside, tending the wounded, and securing the remaining weapons. We were battered, bruised, and exhausted, yet a new strength ran through us, an unspoken promise that this land would no longer be claimed through fear. The red-haired woman tended the horses, her fire unbroken. The blonde began sorting what papers we had recovered, evidence that would bring Morrison's crimes to light. The older woman organized supplies, her calm presence grounding us. The black-haired woman stood beside me, her green eyes catching the first rays of dawn as if she could hold the sun itself. The quiet one checked the cabin's perimeter, a shadow ready to strike, her vigilance absolute. 3 days later, the valley was quiet. The cabin gate, once a symbol of terror, was rebuilt, stronger than before. Every nail we drove in, every plank we raised, was a testament to the blood and courage that had carried us through the storm. We weren't just building a house. We were forging a family, bound by survival, trust, and the knowledge that together, we could withstand anything. The morning sun broke through the hills, casting silver light across a valley that had been claimed not by Morrison, but by those who refused to yield. I poured coffee, watching the women tend the land, the animals, and the evidence of justice we carried. For the first time, the cabin felt like a home, not a battlefield. I realized then what I had truly inherited. Not just land, not just a cabin, but a family forged in fire, and the chance to fight for something that mattered.